We had a number of questions that we prepared for you, but maybe we can go very briefly into these questions. And I actually want to focus on the second one first, because I think it came up in a number of discussions that we had yesterday, today, also here in this session, the importance of universal standards and tools for integrating climate resilience criteria into financial infrastructure investments, infrastructure finance. Sorry. So how important is that? Would it, shouldn't we have like one sort of standard or one sort of definition of what climate resilient infrastructure is, or what adaptation is, for that matter? Would that really help us and move this forward? Because it seems that there are a lot of things already going on. Each have a different angle on what resilience is and what adaptation is. If there's like a, let's say the SCF says, okay, this is adaptation, this is resilience, go ahead, everybody adopt this. Would that really help? Is that necessary, or is there? I don't know. That's a question that I have, and I'm looking at, I don't know who to ask first, but John, you look.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, actually. I mean, the session I attended just before this with Bianc, the Ports Trade Association. They are developing a very highly sophisticated, detailed standard and guidance. Various other sectors, infrastructure sectors, rail, roads, water, energy, there are all sorts of standards and processes out there. Actually, they all follow the same approach, which is standard project risk assessment. There isn't a great deal different how ways in which you actually undertake a risk assessment. I'm less worried about having one size fits all type, here is the way we do it, so much as processes that are generally aligned with each other and follow same sorts of principles. And some of you may know the International Standards Organization is in the process of developing a risk assessment standard as well. So I think it's about alignment rather than one size fits all. On the question of defining adaptation and resilience, as I said earlier, adaptation is not a word that the private sector uses at all. It uses resilience because it's well used to that. That fits very closely with any engineer working in the infrastructure sector intimately knows what resilience means. I would say please don't have another definition of adaptation and resilience. We have enough. All it does is add more confusion to the market. I think we do have to have an element of trust that over time this will bed down. Intuitively, we all understand what adaptation and resilience is, but it is actually quite hard to put down on writing. I think the time is now for getting on and doing something, and we'll tidy up the definition a bit later on.
Well, thank you. That's helpful. Also, when people ask me what keeps you up at night, it's usually the question, what is adaptation? Because and I've also been working on this for quite a while. But yeah, thank you. Any other panelists want to add anything to this?
I understood John's position, but for me as a policymaker, actually, when practically working that many trials to make some standards or conceptualization, those efforts may lead more confusion than kind of arrangement. So, but for me, I think we need to try to find some common ingredients in the concept. That way, because this is something like a head or tail issue. If you have from the beginning, if you have something common, if you can have consensus in some identification of some concept, then it will be easier for you to develop and improve the following implementation stage. So I think if it's still difficult to identify what adaptation and resilience is, but I think the try to find out some, probably might find out, maybe try to meeting of the minds between in here and to the in the recommendations to the COP. If we can have some even common ingredients we can agree on, then that will be very much helpful because we can move forward from that on.
That's very helpful. Jessica, anything to add? Otherwise,
Sure. I'll make it quick. So just echoing what you guys have said, standards potentially not so concerned about, but the use of tools and having alignment in the industry is of utmost importance. So tools like cost-benefit analysis or our own green evaluation, or even the TCFD's recommendations, and just kind of going that step further to look at not only kind of transition risks in a 2-degree scenario, but also adaptation risks in a 3 or 4 or adverse scenario, I guess, as well.
Thank you. Yeah, with that, and conscious of time, I think I would just like to check whether there are any questions in the room. I already see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I think we should first go to the questions so we can have time to wrap up, and maybe come back to the other questions as well if we have time at the end. Yes, I saw in the back.
Thank you very much, Peter. I really welcome this opportunity. There are several points I would like to make. One is that we already have in the processes a whole series of activities on adaptation. We have national adaptation processes, national adaptation plans. We have the funding through the Special Climate Change Fund, through the LDC Fund, and all of this is adaptation. Adaptation is the only word that is in the convention. We also have an adaptation fund. That's the first point. The second point is that all of us, all parties to the convention, outside of this convention, at the same time deal with the private sector in our everyday life. It's nothing new that we deal with the private sector. It is now for us to get a better understanding, and I welcome this opportunity to have this, perhaps the beginnings of a dialogue, between us as parties to the convention and private investors. And by the way, like I said, private investors in my country can also involve small and medium-sized enterprises. I had briefing presentations with them to understand how they could, transform, I think was the title of this, transform the financial policy, and it can be transformed. The responsibility lies with the government and lies with they're dealing with the private sector. And that dealing is taking place now, right, every day for all of us. It's nothing new. The second thing is that there seems to be, to me, a misunderstanding that NDCs are only mitigation. For many developing countries, almost all developing countries, it has adaptation. NDCs are nationally determined climate plans, nationally determined contributions to address climate change. And our nationally determined contributions include adaptation. And what we would like, what we're saying here, is how do we then get that kind of financing that's needed here. I would just like to end by saying that there have been attempts, especially by the Adaptation Fund and the Adaptation Fund Board, to already pursue what they call partnership through the UN Fund, for instance, to raise private donations through online the use of tailored partnerships, products with firms and foundations. So this is being done, this has been done. But the experience so far has shown that there, of course, would require high-risk investment, a high upfront investment, and inherent risks. And therefore, so far, the experience has been has not been very productive. But there are the beginnings of it, and I believe that through this forum, and I'm very happy about that, we are able to start this partnership, because really the transformation of matrix, for instance, would be, and I was very happy to hear Agari, the representative, is first saying that there is, they're looking at environmental and social risk, yes, and also benefits, The benefits are not only financial benefits, but they should be looked at in terms of benefits. For instance, lower costs for health because of, adaptation to rising climate, rising sea levels, for instance, which cause production problems, etc. So the beginnings of, I really welcome this possibility of having beginnings of, a good, frank and open, transparent discussions on this, and we welcome that, and all governments will welcome that, because all of us deal with the private sector. Some of us even come from the private sector. But anyway, thanks.
Thank you very much, Benedictus, for that intervention. I think the mic. Thank you very much for that. This one too, maybe. Thank you very much for that intervention, and yeah, I think you raise a very important point, which is the other side. Well, other side, the small, medium enterprises are very important, and having that dialogue also with them at national level, I think also is very important when you talk about implementing climate action. And there's a very good report by a well-known author, which is called "Adapting from the Ground Up," which talks about that. So. But I have another. I had Dominique and then Randy.
Hi there, Dominic from the UK government. So I had a couple of quick questions. Thank you very much for all the presentations. First question on definitions, and I totally accept this idea that it can be counterproductive at times to get bogged down into more and more definitions of adaptation and resilience. Absolutely need a way to move forward beyond that. Just to sort of flag that what I think is useful is a working definition from the perspective of accounting, which is a kind of a boring term, but actually is a really important part of the UNFCCC process in terms of both donor countries being able to show the work that they're doing and the results of their climate finance, and developing countries being able to verify the climate finance being reported. So just a comment on that work ongoing through the UNFCCC, I think needs to come to a good working definition of adaptation and resilience in the context of climate finance. And a second question just about mobilization. So this is a really interesting panel looking at the scope from a donor country through to pure private sector initiative, and what will be really, really important over the next few years, particularly in the context of the 100 billion goal, will be clarity and real results in terms of private finance mobilized by public interventions. So just a comment on this from a donor country perspective, we need to be able to prove additionality with our development spend. So this is tricky when it comes to something like resilient infrastructure. So the question would be, I guess, to the panel, from your experience, how do we identify that niche of projects that wouldn't go ahead without public intervention, so that the public sector can justify intervention to then mobilize those big figures that Jess, you mentioned, then from the private sector? Thanks very much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for all the excellent presentations. My question, I think, will help us get at number 3, and it's short but rather open-ended. It's what is the what kind of helpful role could the public sector play, either domestically back home in developing countries, and also the international community play in helping to facilitate some of these innovative things that are going on in the space of transforming the financial system? I think it's easier for me to see where the public sector can be more helpful, and we're talking about obviously things like enabling environments or prioritizing concessional finance, but particularly in this space, because I agree completely with a lot of the things that I think you all already highlighted, the importance of some of these things being private sector led, and led by the private finance community. And then also, in the space of standardization, we're at early days of all of this, a little bit of private sector competition with each other on who's got the best methodology seems quite healthy. So totally agree on the definitional space, but I'm curious, and it would be great if the answer is you all don't need to do anything more. We're really taking the lead ourselves on this, but if there are areas where it would be helpful for additional public sector support, it would be interesting to hear those.
Yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, that goes to the final question also, I think, from this the panel. So what is the takeaway? Who needs to do what? And what is the role, especially of the public sector in this? So we have two concrete questions I think that we need to address. One is how do you identify projects that otherwise would not go ahead? And the second one is, so what is the role of the public sector in transforming the financial sector? So I don't know, we start off with the first question. Who wants to, so how do you identify projects that otherwise would not go ahead?
I mean, one of the challenges is my company's been involved. We've worked with over 20 countries now in developing their national adaptation plans. And so much of the national adaptation planning process is understandable about stakeholder engagement, stakeholder-led workshops, developing ideas and approaches and thoughts, but that is honestly light years away from ending up with a project that can be implemented on the ground. So when we look at the back of the National Adaptation Plan and we see the list of actions, that's just the start of a process, not the end. And so it really is a challenge one of the biggest challenges is increasing the capacity of and it's not just developing countries, also developed countries, to actually design projects. And that exists across all ministries, it exists across all levels of NGOs and CSOs, and with the private sector in any country. And of course the project has to be designed in a different way depending on who you're going to funding, because each funder, each source of funding has their different priorities and different challenges. And for anybody who's been involved in GCF project preparation and the level of work that has to be done to actually put forward a concept for the project for GCF, you'll appreciate it is not an easy task. And I've heard it said to me from small line developing states, we will not look at GCF, it's far too complicated, we'll go straight to bilateral funding, it's far quicker, far cheaper, far easier. So there are all those sorts of challenges there about physically getting to the point of having a project. In the future, though, we need to be thinking about this in a different way, that the private sector is beginning to identify the projects themselves and saying this is a project we should be investing in. And again, that's about people having greater transparency on data, on knowledge, on risks and impacts, and picking up the comment before, absolutely on opportunities. Businesses don't invest in risk, they invest in opportunity. So what we need to do is identify, when we're talking about adaptation projects, we need to put that emphasis on what are the opportunities that come out of this project and the benefits that it derives. So those are pretty important challenges we face, instead of thinking that we must express climate change as just as a risk issue. Now, if anybody criticises me, I'm not saying climate change is a good thing. It's an horrendous, bad thing. We are in a bad place. But we have to recognise that the way we get out of this is to work out how do we define the opportunities. Every risk is an opportunity. That's the way this has to be looked at.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, Jessica?
Just to add to that, on this question, completely agree with everything John's outlined. But also kind of thinking forwards, perhaps some kind of way to identify where projects are struggling to find this financing, and perhaps by looking at appetite within the private sector and also kind of risk-adjusted returns, the profile of the project, and whether that can be matched with the appetite of the investors, then perhaps we can see where kind of a little bit of concessional finance might go a long way in order to kind of just bump the project metrics up to something that is going to be appetizing for the private sector.
Thank you. Konjo, also, if you want to address also the second question.
Yeah, I think I can answer to the Randy's question together. The public sector's role, just from the experience of Korea, Korea's population is about 50 million. So, and the size of the territories that are at Morocco size. So it's very we have many private sectors like big companies, including Jabos, and the way it moves. Well, in Korea's case, private sector is very even they are kind of reserved, and they don't like that risk much. So at the beginning, public sector's role is very important. Public sector does not do everything, but in Korea we lead the way, and we show the policy directions. For example, if we have a new government launched, currently. And the new government is just 120 years old, very new, and very enthusiastically leading the way now. Many policy and domestic policies, including economic policies, and of course, we have many issues related to like trying to change to a renewable energy era, trying to avoid fine particle issues in Korea and other very green financing issues. So if the government leads the way, and there are some, just like Jessica said, we have some projects, even in GCF projects and other MDBs projects, we co-financing. Like Korea's ODA is one of them is concessional loans, EDSF, which provides very low, very high concessionality. That case, the private sectors can come and easily. So it's a co-financing scheme. So that way, probably, I think Korea's case, public sector's role is still important, and also we can go together with the private sectors. Many private sectors also asks us to lead the way, and the government has the convening power, like MDBs. So it's one way that very important, and we can make regulations for like guidelines for green bonds, and those things that we can do. So provide many supports and leadership. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Konjo. And that, yeah, I think wraps up also. Or John, you want to add something? I think it was
just in response to that question of what can the public sector do. I mean, the public sector role is to de-risk. That's what it does. It de-risks the economy, so you can have economic and growth and development. But one very practical task each government could do is change the procurement process. If governments write into their procurement processes that when they're funding and paying for example, infrastructure, we want a road from A to B, it's that we want the road from A to B that meets these levels of service and will continue to deliver those levels of service in 10, 15, 20, 30 years' time. It's a very simple change in the procurement process. It can be done. And I'll give you a practical example of where it's not happening. We did a report for the World Bank last year looking at public-private partnerships, a major way of funding infrastructure, and national adaptation planning. We looked at 15 countries chosen randomly, developed and developing countries. Every one of those countries had a statutory national adaptation plan or climate change statement, very clear of what their objectives were for their country. Every one of those countries also had a statutory framework for PPPs, how they should be run, what they should do, and the process. Not one of those 15 PPPs mentioned the words climate change. So when an investor comes along, or where the country starts to look at infrastructure investment, it follows the PPP framework process, and you end up with infrastructure that is not resilient. It's just simple changes, and it requires institutional change as well.
Thank you very much, John. I think that was a very practical addition to this session, and I would like to thank the speakers. And but also, to wrap up, I think this also your remark brings us a little bit back to the remark that I made in the beginning. We discovered that from the government we're not very good at managing infrastructure, and we actually discovered that it's better if we set the design standards and we give this to the private sector. Tell them we need this kind of uptime or amount of cars or amount of safety, and set the standards in a procurement process and let them handle this process. This works for the Netherlands, might of course not work in every country, but our experience has been very positive. And thinking back on the discussion that we had, I think we have a number of points that really came out, and one is that the governments should take the lead in at least in de-risking investments, at least in the short term, and in the longer term we'll probably see that as the private sector gets more experience, you will see more private sector funding also flowing through to these climate resilient investments. And a concrete recommendation there is where you can start as a government is to change procurement guidelines and requirements. And that standard setting is important, but we don't need one system, at least as long as they're aligned on sort of the key elements. And then in this whole process, disclosure and transparency will be important in order to make risks visible and also to guide investors to less risky or more robust investments. And this was, I think, was raised a good start of a discussion with on the role of the private sector, with also the private sector. And I think we need to learn to speak each other's language a little bit more. But this session was, I think, was a very good start, and we're looking forward to a continuation of that. And thank you very much. And applause for everybody.